In order to get started, we are going to want to download Blender. So go to blender.org, and the first page that you see will have this download button. Click the download button, and then you'll have the option to download the newest version of Blender. In this case, it's Blender 4.2.1, so just download whichever is the newest one. Hit that download button, and you'll be given the option to donate to Blender if you would like, but you can notice that the download has already begun. Sometimes you will want to use add-ons or assets that are not yet supported on the most recent versions of Blender. And if you need a previous version, you can look for this button here where it says Previous Versions, and then you can click Download Any Blender, and it will give you an option to download any version of Blender that has ever been released. And so from here you can select the version that supports the add-on you are trying to use, download it, and then open it to use that add-on. Once you have the program downloaded, open it and follow your system prompts to install it on your machine. Once it's installed, you are ready to open it and begin your 3D journey. When you first open Blender, you'll see a screen something like this, but it will have some options for you to choose. Leave them all at their default settings and click outside of that screen into your program. This is the default view in Blender, and I want to give you a quick overview of what you are looking at. What you are looking at here is your 3D viewport. This is where all of the magic happens. Everything that is visualized in 3D in your scene will show up right here. Over to the right in this top corner of the screen, you've got what's called the outliner, and this keeps track of all of the different objects within your scene. You can see here it says we have camera, we have a cube, and we have light. And as we select them over here in the outliner, you can see that they are highlighted in the viewport. This panel over here is called the Properties panel. As the name implies, it gives us information about the properties of any given piece of the 3D scene. Everything from your render settings, to your modifier stack, to the individual object transformations, to vertex data, to your materials that are rendered out in the final image. All of that information is found in the Properties panel. The last window I want to show you is this one down below, and that is the timeline. This one shows us where we are in time in our scene. You can hit this play button right here and play the scene forward. There's no animation in the default scene currently, so there's nothing moving, but if we had animation happening, then it would be playing right now as the timeline is played. If you wanted to adjust any of these windows, you can simply click and drag in between them to adjust their position in the scene. You can also change any of these tabs to display any of this information. So if I go up here to the top left and I hit the editor type, then I could even go over here and select the Properties panel, and now this panel is here in the main window. I can change to the shader editor to adjust shader properties. I can switch to an image editor to view images that I'm using within the scene. And this same is true of any of these windows. So Blender's user interface is incredibly modular. And in fact, Blender has preloaded multiple layouts for you to use as you work. You can switch to a modeling layout that eliminates the timeline on the bottom and focuses on the modeling. There is a sculpting workspace, one for UV editing, and so on down the line. But you can always lay out the windows as you want. If you wanted to add another window, I can right-click here and select Vertical Split, and that gives me the option to split either one of the windows that I just right-clicked on in between. So if I click here, now we've got another window. So now I can change this to my shader editor if I wanted to work on the shaders in my scene. If I want to collapse this and I want to get rid of this window, I can right click in between these two and click Join Areas. Then it gives me the option to decide which of the areas do I want to merge into the other. So in this case, I want the 3D viewport, so I am going to expand the 3D viewport to encompass that whole area. And so that's just a quick look at Blender's interface, how you manipulate it, and how you can find what you're looking for. Let's talk about the 3D viewport. In order to move around the viewport, use your middle mouse button to click and drag to rotate around your scene. If you want to zoom in and out, you can scroll up on your mouse wheel or scroll down to zoom. There's also a button over here for zoom in, zoom out. Just click and drag, and that will manipulate your zoom in the scene. You can also shift and middle mouse click to grab the scene and move it left and right or up and down along a single plane. If you want to fly around your scene, you can hit Shift and the tilde key at the top left of your keyboard, and then just use your mouse and point in the direction you want to go, and use the AWSD keys on your keyboard to move through the scene. If you hit Shift while you're moving, it will accelerate your movements, and that will allow you to fly around and view your 3D scene. Simply left click to exit that mode, and then now we're able to rotate once again. Now you'll notice that we are pivoting around a point out here, no longer pivoting around our cube. If you want to change the pivot point, you can select a cube and hit the period on your number pad, and it will frame the selected object. You can also perform that operation by selecting View and then Frame Selected. There are some other ways to manipulate the view in your scene. If you hit the 1 button on the number pad, you will move to the front orthographic view of your scene. You can see it up here in this top left, says front orthographic. If you hit the 3 key on the number pad, you'll move to right orthographic, and if you use the 7 key, you'll move to top orthographic. So now we are looking directly straight down in an orthographic mode. There are a couple of different view modes here in the 3D viewport. Currently we are in the solid view mode, and you can see these pies if you hit the Z key on your keyboard. It pops up and it gives you the description: solid, material preview, wireframe, and render. These are also represented up here by these 4 icons. The furthest left is called wireframe view. In this view, the object is entirely transparent and all you see is the wireframe outline. The solid mode is what we have been in which it is rendered at just a traditional gray clay style render. If you go to material preview, it is now previewing the material that is on our object, and this reveals that we have no material. So I'm going to change the material's color to something orange. Let's make it metallic, and then let's make it a little bit more shiny. If I change to rendered view, now this is showing us exactly what the scene would look like in a render. Our cube is now taking into account this light, and if I were to move that light closer, it begins to get brighter. I can change the power of that light and it would affect the scene and how it looks, but this is my rendered view. One last thing to note is in the 3D viewport, you have this toolbox here on the left-hand side that shows you some of the tools you can use for manipulating objects in your scene. And if you need information about your scene or objects in it, you can hit the N key to bring up this transform tab. Then you can switch from item information to tool information to view information. And then the rest of these tabs have to do with add-ons. So now that we know our way around the 3D viewport, I want to talk about creating and manipulating objects within your 3D scene. Let's begin by deleting all of the objects that are default. I'm going to select all of them by clicking and dragging around them, and then I'm going to hit X to delete and select delete. They're gone. To add a new object, hit Shift and A on your keyboard to bring up this add menu. From this add menu, you can select many different things, but I'm going to select a mesh and I'm going to select cube, and now we have our cube back. The same thing can happen if you go up here to the add menu at the top, select mesh, and then this time I'm going to do UV sphere. It's about time that I teach you the most important shortcut in Blender. That is Control and Z. If you didn't intend to add the sphere and you did, you can always hit Control Z to undo your progress. If you hit Control Z too many times though, and now you have gone back too far and deleted your cube, you can hit Control Shift and Z to redo the last operation and bring your cube back. If you want to duplicate an object, you can simply select that object and hit Shift and D on your keyboard, and then you'll notice that if you move your mouse around, you now have the duplicated object attached to your cursor. You can left click to apply the transformation. However, if you duplicate and you want the duplicate to sit exactly where the other one was, you can hit the right click on your mouse, and now it looks like nothing has happened, but the object has actually snapped back to its original position. So if I move this object, you can see I actually have 2 of them. I'm going to delete that cube. When it comes to manipulating objects in your 3D scene, you have 3 options. You can move, you can rotate, and you can scale. If I select this cube and then turn on my move gizmo over here, you'll see a set of handles has popped up on my object. I can click and drag any one of these handles to move the object along that axis. So I can move it along the X, along the Y, along the Z. You can also lock which axes you don't want to be used. So for instance, if I had this cube sitting on a floor and I wanted it to remain on the floor, but I wanted to move it somewhere and I didn't want to have to use one handle and then the next, I can click and drag this little cube here, which locks the Z axis, meaning that it's not going to move up and down on the Z at all. It's only moving in the X and Y directions. The same is true with this handle here. It locks the X axis so that the object will not move on the X. And if we turn to the side, the same happens predictably with the Y axis, where we lock the Y and we're only moving along the X and the Z. The shortcut for these transformations are the G key. I can hit G on the keyboard, and now I've grabbed the object and I'm moving it around. If I want to get that same limitation of axes, I can hit the X key, and now I am only moving on the X. And so on with the Y, and with the Z. If I wanted to lock the z-axis, I would type in Shift Z, and that would lock the z-axis, and the same with the others, Shift Y and Shift X. If I want to undo my transforms that I've made to the movement of a cube, I can hit the alternate key on the keyboard and the G key, and it will undo those transformations. Let's talk about rotation. Click the rotation gizmo. The gizmo works just like you would expect. If you grab the red handle, it rotates around the x-axis. If you grab the Y, around the Y, Z, around the Z. The shortcut for this operation is R. If you want to constrain your rotation along the Z, X, or the Y, it works the exact same as the transformation, as the move key. And if you want to undo the rotations that you've applied, hit alternate R. If you want to scale an object, you can hit the scale gizmo, and this works just like the other gizmos. I can scale along the Y, along the X, along the Z. I can constrain the scale to the X and Y. I can lock the Y-axis, or I can lock the X-axis. The shortcut for this transformation is the S key, and of course I can lock that transformation on the basis of axes as well. If I want to undo the scale, predictably hit Alt S to undo all scale operations. A couple of points about the way 3D objects work in the 3D scene. First of all, I want you to notice something called the 3D cursor. If you select this cursor icon up to the top left of your tool panel, and then begin to click, you'll see that a red and white circle is popping itself every time you click. And this red and white circle came from the origin of the world, which is at the intersection between the X and the Y and the Z. This 3D cursor just serves as a reference point that can be referenced by other objects in the scene. Now that this is out of our way, you can see that there is a little orange dot at the center of our object. And this orange dot is what is known as the origin point of the object. This origin point can change position. If I right-click and set origin to 3D cursor, now the orange dot is located at the current position of the 3D cursor. If I hit G and grab my object and move it, you'll see that the dot moves along with it. That dot is not only the origin point for the object, it is also the default pivot point for the object. So if I begin rotating now, then it's rotating around the pivot point. If I begin scaling, it's going to scale around that point. The origin point is the default pivot point for any transformations that you're making to an object. You can change the default pivot point by hitting the period key on the keyboard and selecting one of these here. In this case, I'm going to select 3D cursor, and now when we rotate, instead of rotating around the object's origin point, the object is rotating around the 3D cursor in our scene. I can set the origin point back to the geometry, and then I'll undo the transformations that I've applied. If you want to rename an object in the scene, you can select it up here in the outliner, double-click, and type in box. Or you can select it here in the 3D viewport and hit the F2 key on your keyboard and then type in a name for your new box and hit enter. You'll see that the new name has been now applied in the outliner. Also, in this object properties panel over here, you'll see the name of your item, and you'll see that you can select here and change it to something other than what you had before, and it is updated now in the outliner. If you want to hide an object in your 3D scene, let's say we have 3 different cubes, and I want to hide one, I can hit the H key as it is selected, and it will hide that object. And you'll notice what has happened in the outliner is this little eyeball icon has gone dark. It means it is hidden in the viewport. I can unhide it by simply clicking this eyeball back on, or I can hit the alternate H on my keyboard to bring it back. If I wanted to hide everything else in the scene except this cube, I could hit Shift and H, and that automatically has turned off the viewport visibility of all items except this one, and I can get them back with the alternate H key as well. Another hidden but helpful filter is up here under the restriction toggle filters. If you click this little drop down and then select this cursor icon, you now have an option in your outliner to change the selectability of an object. With the selectability toggle enabled, I can now click this cursor icon for the plane, and the selectability has been turned off in my viewport, so I can select all of these objects here in the scene without once selecting my floor. If I want to turn it back on, of course, I have to go into my outliner and enable selectability here. Well, this is all that you need to know to begin building out your 3D scene. So far we have been manipulating objects, and that means that we have been in object mode. You'll see up here that there are 6 different modes you can switch between, and in some cases there are even more. But what we want to talk about is this one, the edit mode. If I switch over to edit mode right now, you'll see that the object that I had selected has changed, and we now have all of these dots that are selected. If I begin clicking here in my viewport, you'll see that we can select each one of these dots individually. These are what are known as vertices, the vertex of the scene. So this is one vertex, and together they make up the object. Now it's important to understand the difference between an object and the object properties of the vertex, because when we hit tab and we go into edit mode, it is as if we have entered the container and now have the ability to manipulate individual aspects of the scene. So if I click and drag over this top part of my cylinder and begin scaling, I can begin adjusting that individual portion of the object. If I, even with the most radical transformations, tab back into edit mode, this is still just one object that I am manipulating. And this is somewhat visually represented up here. If you go to your outliner and select the cylinder, you'll see that it has a drop down. This is the object level, and this is the vertex level, the vertex data that is baked into this object. If I wanted to begin making transformations to this torus or to this sphere, I would have to first select the sphere and then hit tab to change between object mode and edit mode to gain access to the vertices of this torus. So let's talk about the individual parts that make up a 3D object. There are 3 of them: the vertex, the edge, and the face. These are vertices right here, and you can select them because we are in vertex select mode. And you know that we are in vertex select because this button up here is highlighted blue. If I switched to this one, this is edge select mode. And now as we click in the 3D scene, we are selecting edges. An edge is any line between 2 vertices. We can then switch to face select mode and begin selecting the faces of the mesh. There are also shortcuts that allow you to change what your selected mode is. If I am in edit mode and I hit the 1 key on the keyboard, then I will switch to vertex select mode. If I hit 2, I am now in edge select mode, and if I hit the 3 key, I am now in face select mode. You can select what's called a loop of faces by hitting the alternate key and selecting an edge between 2 faces and left clicking. That selects the entire loop. If I wanted to do the same with an edge, for instance this top edge, I would hit the alternate key and select a single edge, and that entire edge loop would be selected. All of the transformations that we learned can be applied to objects can be applied to individual sets of vertices as well. With this top face selected, I can hit R to rotate it. I can hit S to scale it. I can hit G to move it. But I want to introduce you to a couple of operations that happen in edit mode again and again and again. The first one is called the inset. If I hit the I key on my keyboard, I can perform what's called an inset operation. Now you'll see that this little dotted line has appeared between where my cursor was at the time I pressed the button and the center of the object that I'm manipulating. And this just gives me essentially a handle from which I can scale up or scale down to perform the operation. Now I'm going to scale until I have it about there, and then I'm going to left click to apply the operation. That's an inset. Another one of the most popular operations that you do in editing is an extrusion. And in order to access this, you can hit the E key on the keyboard to create an extrusion, and that just extrudes whatever vertices you are currently selected in the direction of their normal. So I'm going to move this up a bit and then left click to apply. Another incredibly popular operation that you will use again and again and again is called the bevel. To perform a bevel, hit Ctrl and B. Now it looks like nothing is happening because we have this line, but that's because in order to perform the bevel, you have to drag out away from the center point of your selection. And you'll see that dragging out increases or decreases the effect. Before I left click to apply the operation, I can also scroll up on my mouse wheel to add edge loops to my bevel. And I am going to add quite a few here, and then left click to apply. We could add another bevel on this outer edge. I'm going to switch to edge select mode. I'm going to hit alternate and click and hit Ctrl B to apply a bevel, and let's make this one more of a chamfer bevel by rolling down on the mouse wheel and applying the transformation. Now I'm going to right click my object and I'm going to shade auto smooth, and that's going to smooth out my shading. And here we go. We have created a button for the end of this lesson. And with this, you know almost everything you need to get started in edit mode in Blender. So let's talk about rendering. Because at the end of the day, our 3D objects are nothing if they are not seen. We want to be able to show off a final image of the things that we have created. In order to do that, you need the 3 basic components of every scene. And these 3 basic components are there when you open Blender's startup file. They are the object itself, in this case a monkey, a light in order to light the scene and allow you to see things, and then a camera in order to capture it. So let's add those 3 things here. We need a light. So if you hit Shift and A and then go down to this light tab, I'm going to add a sun. Now nothing has happened. We've added a light to our scene, but nothing has changed, and that is because we are not in the rendered view mode. We are currently in the viewport mode called solid. So let's switch this by hitting the Z key on our keyboard, moving up to this rendered mode and selecting it. Now you can see that we have a light that is projecting directly down and is creating and casting this shadow. If I rotate with the R key, I can rotate my light and begin to put it in position where the light is coming down from a little bit of an angle. I can also change the intensity of my light by selecting my light and being in the light properties panel. I'm going to change that to 3 and hit enter, and now we've got a brighter scene. In order to capture this though, we need a camera. So I'm going to hit Shift and A again, and down here we have a camera option. The camera has been located here at the floor. If I move back to wireframe view, you can see the camera and kind of which direction it's pointing. So I'm going to grab it and move it along the y-axis, grab it and move it up here on the Z, and then let's rotate it on the Z so that it's aiming somewhere toward the monkey. Well, how do we see what's happening in the camera view? There are 2 ways to do this. You can hit the 0 key on your keyboard on your number pad, or you can hit this toggle camera view, and it even shows if you hover over it that the shortcut is number pad 0. So I'm going to click on that and then go back to rendered view, and now we can see what is being rendered out of our camera. I can hit, while I'm in the camera view, Shift and the tilde key, and then move the view around to where I want it to be, or I can use the AWSD keys to fly around the scene just like you would in a video game and position your camera where you want it. We are now ready to render out our scene. You can hit the F12 key on your keyboard, or you can go up to this render option and hit render image in order to create your render. And there we have it, our first render ever, a beautiful monkey head, and we can hit image and then save this image, and it will give us the option to save it locally on our computer and then share it or do whatever we want with it from there. Let me show you a couple ways to change the settings for your render, and those are over here in the render properties panel. You can select between 2 different render engines. These are ways of processing the image in the scene. The Eevee render engine that's set up default is a real-time render engine, which in layman's terms means that it's faster. It renders in real time. Now you can change the fidelity of the real-time renderer by adding ray tracing, which is going to begin to trace the bounces of light through your scene and give you a more realistic result. And there are a host of other options here that you can begin to mess with. For now though, let's switch over to what's called the Cycles render engine and see what this does. You can already see that there is a big difference between Cycles and Eevee. It is using ray tracing by default, and it's made to be more of a realistic based render. Over here in the Render Properties panel, you can decide whether it is the CPU of your computer or the graphics processor that is computing the render. In my case, I have a dedicated GPU, and so I'm going to select that because it will be faster than my CPU when it comes to rendering. And then the other important thing to note here is the maximum number of samples for the render. 4096 is the default, but that's quite a bit, so I'm going to pull this down to 100 and hit enter, and then let's render out a Cycles render and see how this looks. You'll notice that this is taking a little bit longer. We are up to samples 96 of 100, and it took us 5 seconds to make the render as opposed to less than a second for the Eevee render, but here's the result. If you wanted to change the resolution of your output, you can change the output settings here by scrolling up to the top. Currently by default it's 1920 by 1080, that's HD resolution. There are some preset options up here as well. You can select up here for some 4K resolution, or you can set the resolution manually to whatever you would like. And that's how you create an image of your 3D scene. If this was useful to you, please do us a favor and hit that subscribe button and share your finished renders over in our Discord server. We would love to see them.